I maybe should sing, but Denise says that the fee is to make sure that I don't. Thank you for coming. I hope that this whole hour is worth your time. Time is a lot more important to me now than money, especially since I have two little kids who I'm missing tonight, and I always miss when I leave them. So my name is Joy Pullman. I work for the Heartland Institute. It's a Chicago-based state-focused think tank. So I work in their education division, and I run their newspaper, and I do the research and policy side as well. I answer questions that state legislators have. And as Denise said, I've been traveling the country almost nonstop in the past couple of months, and my schedule is almost completely booked through mid-October, when I'm going to take some time off to have another baby. So it's going to be an exciting couple of months. So let's see here. So it's been extremely busy, and the Common Core thing has just popped up overnight. So it's kind of crazy to see something that I've been paying attention to and reading all the documents for several months in advance, just all of a sudden, light a brush fire around the country. So as Denise said, I'm here to give kind of a nonpartisan, just kind of factual look, especially at the other side. There's a lot of things that you'll hear from Common Core proponents, but you won't often hear the other side represented very well. So I'll talk about back and forth both sides, but I'm emphasizing the critics of Common Core because I am one, and I think the evidence is a reason for that. So all of the statements that I make today, I can back up with hard copy of evidence. So if you want to email me and get, where's your source for that, some of it is linked here in the presentation, and I'll mention it as we go. But if you want that, or if you need to give it to anybody who's asking you, prove that to me, I'm really happy to do that. Because I think, facts are important, and people who say things should be able to back them up. Especially because some of the things you're going to hear are a little astonishing. So it's really important to me, especially professionally and credibility-wise, that I make sure that the things that I tell you, I've actually seen myself. So my job is what parents, what normal people like you who have kids, who have jobs, who have families and communities to live in, you don't have time, most of you, well maybe some of you do, I don't know where you would find it, to sit around reading 700-page contracts between the federal government and states and testing companies, but that's my job, so that's what I do. So I'll tell you what I have found in the next, I hope we'll take 45 minutes here, then I'd like to get as many questions as possible, so I'll stay until probably about 10 o'clock, so we'll see. Often I have been places where literally the question and answer period took 3 hours and there were still people waiting in lines to ask more questions. So I'll try to get to that as quickly as possible. Before we get there, let's just kind of do an overview of what Common Core is. So you hear a lot of different things from a lot of different people. So I'm just going to give you some basic facts. This is a map from the Common Core folks showing about all the states that have adopted Common Core. They did it in 2010, so you just see 5 holdouts, and Minnesota's kind of a half holdout. They adopted the English standards, but not the math standards. Oh, maybe this is a good time to remind you, if your phone is on, maybe you should turn it to silent or turn it off. I did the calculations, and you'll see some numbers in a minute. But in 2010, in just the span of a few months, almost every state in the country switched over. They took their state education standards and tests, and they traded them over for something called Common Core. So it's a big deal. It has a very big change, and it's practically the whole country. And actually, Alaska, I just testified to their education committee, maybe a month ago. Alaska technically hasn't signed on to Common Core, but they replaced their state standards almost verbatim with Common Core with a few technical changes, and they're adopting the Common Core test. So it's kind of debatable as to whether to call them a Common Core state. They are practically, for all intents and purposes, another Common Core state. All right, but Texas most definitely is not, and just recently passed another law affirming that they shall never use Common Core, and they totally hate it. So that's kind of the Texas way of looking at things. So I did the calculations for the enrollment of children who are attending Common Core public schools, and it's 87% of U.S. children. That doesn't include the Alaska children, but there aren't that many children in Alaska, so I don't think it would increase the percentage too much. So that's almost 43 million children. So you can see over here kind of I did a bar graph just to kind of show how many children are in public schools in Common Core states versus public schools in non-Common Core states, and then separately in private and home schools. And actually Common Core does affect private and home schools, but we'll talk about how that happens. Actually, yeah. Okay, so I'll actually just kind of sketch how Common Core affects private and home schools right now by talking about what Common Core touches. I switched my slides around just before, here we go, coming tonight. So I'll go here. So what is Common Core? people say a bunch of different things. But the basic thing is they're what they call education standards. And so what that really is a list of what a bunch of people on a bunch of committees thought that kids need to know in English, language arts, and math from grades K to 12. So you have things like, grade 3, the child should be learning about fractions in this manner, and so on and so forth. There's a lot more out there. That's kind of an easy thing for you to comprehend, and I encourage you to go look them up and just kind of read through them. And so when people talk about standards, they do say easy things to understand. We need to know when a child should be good at multiplication, so on and so forth. But there's a lot in the standards that isn't very easy to comprehend for someone who isn't an education professional. How do you know if a child should be fluent in analyzing a paragraph in 5th grade? How do we know that that's an appropriate grade level thing? So it's kind of a complicated thing for an average person to approach. That's why we'll talk a little bit about the researchers or analysts who do know about content, what they say about Common Core in a little bit. So Common Core itself is just the math and English, but associated science standards just came out this spring. We'll talk about them in a little bit, and people are predicting that most states will adopt those as well, and that's actually likely for Illinois. And the social studies / history standards are in the long-term plans, but that's a really controversial subject, and that down the last attempt at national standards, so it's likely that will take a number of years here. So the goal that Common Core states, in its own documents, and that you'll hear a lot from people who support Common Core, is we want to get kids ready for college or career. So that means, to graduate from high school. Their next thing should be college or career. There have been some questions about that, because a lot of people have said, this actually was just out in the Wall Street Journal, I think, last week, to say that, it was in the Boston Globe. It was one of the fellows who had put in Massachusetts best in the nation standards about a decade ago, 15 years ago. He was saying it's ludicrous to think that the exact same preparation fits you for a generic liberal arts college or a generic career. Careers are so varied, for one thing, and then the kind of college preparation is different. And that's kind of a consideration we'll get to in a little bit. So who made Common Core? You also hear, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, states made Common Core, but I don't know about you, but my state doesn't just get up and walk around and talk to other states. That it takes people, and so who were the people involved? Well, really, it wasn't any legislative body or any state board of education, but it was 2 organizations that are private nonprofits called the National Governors Association and the Chief Council of State School Officers. So then I looked into the financial records of both of those organizations, and CCSSO, I'll use those abbreviations because they have long names, is about half funded by the federal government, and NGA is 80% funded by the federal government. But they are private nonprofits. They're essentially trade organizations or lobbying groups. They do not have any legislative authority like a state legislature does. They're basically, a place where people convene for networking opportunities, where the governors essentially get together voluntarily and talk about whatever they want, while people can come meet them and have. There's kind of the New York Times for decades has been looking into NGA, kind of trying to accuse them of a pay-to-play sort of thing, because folks in the corporate world can sponsor meetings that governors go to, and then they get access to the governors right there in one handy little package behind closed doors. They can talk to them about whatever they want after sponsoring the event. I actually talked to former Virginia Governor George Allen. He said that was one of the reasons he went, because he was trying to get business to come to Virginia. But one of the important things to know about both of those organizations is that when they got a bunch of committees together to write Common Core, we'll talk about that process in a little bit, since they're private nonprofits, none of the meetings happened in public. And it took a lot of public pressure to actually just get them to release the names of people who worked on these committees. So we don't have anything that you could get from a state board of education or a state legislature, such as meeting notes, who attended, email conversations between the folks that were involved, what some people were pushing for and what ultimately happened. None of that communication that would typically be subject to open records, open meeting laws, with this kind of a thing that has such an impact on children. That's all a black box, and it will continue to be a black box as long as those organizations prefer to keep it so, which is probably in their best interest. I've called them several times asking for more information about their processes, and they would just send me press statements. And I just thought, I can search your website for the press statement. I won't talk to a human being, but no. So the other player involved in funding the National Governors Association and Council of Chief State School Officers That was the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which has funded Common Core and a push for national standards since the early 2000s. So I calculated using their grants finder how much money they put into Common Core by, I think, about February of this year, when it's since grown. It was $163 million that the Gates Foundation throughout the country has put into Common Core since it began. So there's a lot of special interest influence, there's a lot of behind door behavior, there's a lot of things that people who are the voters who will be affected by Common Core, teachers, parents, that we just don't know and we will never know, and we didn't have a voice in the process because all of this happened, and then we'll talk about later how states chose to pick up. So we'll talk about the adoption process in just a second, but I want to back up and just say, and go on to the second point here, about how big Common Core is. So you think education standards, what a random topic, why would 80 people want to sit together and pay money to hear somebody blather on about some random education policy that nobody but Wonks cared about 5 years ago? And that's true, nobody but Wonks cared about it. Because literally it changes what and how children will learn across the country. So because of Common Core, you have to get new technology. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But the short thing is that all the tests, the Common Core tests coming out in 2014, 2015, they must be on computers by 2017. So no more paper and pencil, which is a huge struggle for a lot of school districts. The second one is text and books and materials. Everything in the classroom that a child receives lesson-wise has to be reformatted to fit Common Core. It's a new progression, new style of learning. Teacher training, everyone's talking about, of course, teachers, have been saying, now I feel like I'm back in my first year of teaching, which if you know much about teaching, that's the worst year of teaching ever, when you're entirely new and you're faced with, the sea of children, and you have to take all of that theory from your classes and put it into practice. So teachers, massive more professional development, lots of in-services, lots of consultants, which is really convenient for the consultant industry, and they're really excited about that, as we'll talk about in a little bit. So it changes teacher evaluations and professional development. So if teachers now actually have their professional evaluations where the principal will do a walkthrough in the class every once in a while, that now the thing that the principal is looking for, those are tied to Common Core. Is this teacher teaching in a manner that is aligned with Common Core, that is in accord with what Common Core wants teachers to be doing. So it changes the tests, of course, and tests are the big major thing in education because they drive school funding, whether the state will take over a school, and in some states they influence how a school district will hire and fire teachers. You see a lot of controversy about this right now, or the strike in Chicago, where the mayor was pushing to have more tests play more of a role in teacher training and so on and so forth. So because those will be based on Common Core tests now, Common Core will influence how teachers will be evaluated on their tests. Okay, we'll skip forward and talk about, once folks said, well, people have been wanting to have national standards in this country for a long time. There's a Brookings Institution report from, 2005 or 2006, where the people talking about it said, let's see here. Actually, maybe I'll back up a little bit. I'll come back to this report in a second. Can you raise your hand if you know what Goals 2000 or America 2000 is? Oh, that's almost nobody. Okay. So back in 1989, President George H.W. Bush called all the governors together and said, we want to do national standards. We think that we should have common benchmarks for what kids should learn. And that became the America 2000 Goals 2000 projects, which totally ended with a flop because they released the history, the social science, the social studies standards first, and even Lynn Cheney, who is well known for her history skills. I used to work at the same institute where she's now a fellow. She said, she reversed her support for the idea because they were so bleep awful. They were heavily political, that nobody in either political party supported them, and they went down in the U.S. Senate by 99-0 vote. So that kind of set back the national education movement a little while. So the folks in this Brookings report said that made it pretty clear that people in states are not going to go for any sort of thing that the federal government pushes on them. We can't do federal government making one kind of learning trajectory for children. We've got to get at it through the states. We have to we have to make it look like the states did this, that localities did this, because federal is just not, Americans aren't big on the feds and eds. While that was happening, let's see here. So for some more context, No Child Left Behind, raise your hand if you know what that is. Okay. So that's basically the more recent version of Goals 2000, the next big federal thing. So, so No Child Left Behind was the biggest federal education law in existence ever. Biggest increases in funding, biggest increases in federal control over schools and micromanagement, and that happened in 2011 by bipartisan, so both people on both sides, they all got together and decided to stick it to the American people and kids in schools. And well, the part about that is important right here to think about in terms of national standards is that No Child Left Behind told states, you must set up education standards and you must set up your own tests. And because the federal government it's illegal for them to tell states what to teach children, the federal government could only say you must have some sort of test, some sort of standards, but they couldn't say, all kids have to learn algebra. So then in combination with the federal requirement, so the Fed said, first of all, you set a bar for every child to reach.
We're going to mic you up.
All right.
So we're having problems hearing. Test and see.
Beep, beep.
Let me turn it up.
It's not.
Sorry, we're going to put the mic on there because I could see some in the back can't hear.
Yeah.
I'll just shout. Oh, I think I might hear myself. I'll just shout a little bit so we can continue. So No Child Left Behind said, on the one hand, you have to set a level for what all students have to reach. So they said you have to set, let's see here. So they said all students must reach a bar, but your state gets to set whatever that bar is. But every single student has to reach it by 2014. So predictably, state said, all right, we're going to, I'll use kind of an extreme example, but we're going to require that every child has to be able to add by 8th grade. Predictable, right? So in return for getting the federal money, which of course every state wants, that basically the outcome of that is the federal government said, you do standards and tests. All right. But you set the bar. So of course states set a really low bar, right? Because then every child can, unless you have severe developmental disabilities, you can add and subtract by 8th grade, or what. So it was very, very easy for children to pass the bars that the federal government had pushed states to set. But the reason that the bars were so low is that the federal government had basically created the conditions for that to be a reward for states. So that's really important because in the Common Core fight, people say, oh, but state standards were so terrible before Common Core, they're so low, Common Core is so much better. That's the justification for having a national system. But the point is not that this isn't a story where state action failed, this is a story where the federal government pushed states toward a bad action in order to get massive amounts of federal funds, thus creating the situation, the crisis that became a justification for Common Core. Okay, let's get back to the timeline. That's a fun bunny trail. So if we go back to national standards, back in 2007, it's really important for people to know Common Core is bipartisan. It's not only pushed by the Obama administration. Like I said, as with No Child Left Behind, people on both sides of the aisle fell for all of this, and are eagerly behind it, as people on both sides of the aisle are eagerly against it. So back in 2007, the Gates and the Broad Foundations pledged $60 million for a campaign to create and educate lawmakers about the need for national standards. So the following year, the National Government Association and Chief Council of State School Officers began the Common Core project. They started assembling committees, they started putting out reports, and so on and so forth. And then of course, in the interim there that fall, President Obama was elected. And then this is where folks start, where President Obama, the administration, start getting really excited about Common Core, and because they're so excited about Common Core, they
Pay no attention to the man in
they started pushing states into it, and that's what a lot of people have been objecting to as well. As you might recall, immediately after President Obama came into office, we were right in the middle of a national economic crisis, and the stimulus bill, had already been, talked about and interested in, again, folks from both sides of the parties. That was signed by February 19th of 2009, and included in it a giant pot of money for the U.S. Department of Education that they turned into a program called Race to the Top. And so, in Race to the Top, the Obama administration said to states, we will give you extra points on your shot at winning a bunch of this money during really tight economic times where states are struggling and looking for any way to avoid laying off lots of teachers. But if you want this money, you only have to do a few things. And one of the things that states had to do or got extra points towards doing towards winning for Dewey was adopt Common Core. Now, it's important for you to know that the Race to the Top application doesn't say you must adopt Common Core. It says it includes a definition that only applies to Common Core. You must adopt standards that are common to a majority of states. That definition only applies to Common Core, and it still only applies to Common Core today. So states told the federal government, yes, we will sign on to Common Core, we will do this thing in their Race to the Top applications twice before the Common Core actually was released. So states were saying, we will do this thing, we will switch over our entire education system, but yeah, we haven't looked at the thing that's going to change all of this. So we'll look at that timeline right now. So right here, January 19th was the first, that's got to be February 19th because the stimulus bill wasn't passed then, so that's better. The first Race to the Top deadline to adopt Common Core was February 19th, oh no, this is 2010, so we're good. All right, was January 19th, 2010. So that was the date by which states, oh that's hot.
It's working now.
Hello? Yeah. Oh good, because I don't like to shout, even though I do have children. Okay, so the very first deadline by which states had to say, we commit to doing X, where X is a blank check, was January 19th, 2010. That was, as you see, 2 months before even a draft of Common Core came out. States signed, away, and Illinois was part of that pool of folks saying, yes, please give us money, we'll do whatever you want, essentially, because they haven't even seen the draft of Common Core. And again, there was a second round of Race to the Top and then a third, but the second Race to the Top deadline to adopt Common Core was June 1st, 2010, which as you see here is a day before the final Common Core actually came out. So in both instances, states said, yes, we will do this thing, no, we don't know what it is. So Common Core actually came out on June 2nd, 2010, which you may remember that summer was the healthcare debate. So people were a little busy doing other things while states were adopting Common Core. Woo. And by 32 business days later, most states had adopted Common Core. It was a very, so I looked up all these dates to indicate to you what a very quick process it was. It came, and they're actually, in Wisconsin, where I was a few weeks ago.
Why don't you leave it alone? This thing's working perfectly now. And it's got better sounding speakers up there.
Check.
Can you guys hear better?
I leave it to you. But
Mic, is that loud enough?
Check.
The first wireless mic worked better than this.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the first one was fine.
Can you hear me all right with this one
Yes,
though?
we hear you.
All right, I'll continue.
Let's just go.
So I'm putting up this timeline to indicate to you there were very few, so the state boards of education in most cases did adopt Common Core, but it was literally at their very next meeting after Common Core came out. It wasn't like they sent it around to school districts, they put out a public comment period to say, folks, look, this is a really big thing. It's going to affect almost everything we do about education besides buses and lunch. We think you should read it. We think you should tell us what you think about it. It was really, oh, we know what this is. We already promised we would do it. Now we're just putting our seal on the thing we already promised we would do. And then the second way in which the Obama administration encouraged states to adopt Common Core was through No Child Left Behind waivers. So since you all know what No Child Left Behind is, a waiver is just you don't have to follow the law anymore. And so the Obama administration decided to do that, and this was legally dubious, according to, a bunch of folks raised a cry about this, but there's really nothing that that they could do to stop them because Congress can't pass any education legislation right now. They basically have been deadlocked for a long time. But so the Obama administration basically said to states, we will let you free from these mandates in the law that you hate, that your people hate, that your states hate, that are really annoying you, in exchange for you doing a few things for us. And so the law does not give the law says to the administration, you can waive the law. That means just cut out parts of it for states. You can sever, annoying parts. But it doesn't say you can trade, things for severing those parts. But the Obama administration decided that it could do this. So they said to states, we'll trade you some things in exchange for this, what you want. And one of those things was Common Core. It was another, place where they said you must have standards that are common to a majority of states, which again, still only applies to Common Core, and then it only applied to Common Core. And so all the way by November, so 5 months after Common Core came out, almost all of the states that currently are Common Core states had adopted it. I think this is your $10 show. Okay. So now we're going to actually talk about kind of some of the things that constitute some of the arguments and the controversy about Common Core. I wanted to go through that timeline, first of all, just to talk about the process, but also second of all, so you know that this is why we're talking about this in 2013 instead of back in 2009, 2010, because this is really the first chance that teachers, that lawmakers have had a chance to see what state boards of education have foisted upon them. The people who are going to pay for it, lawmakers, you, the people whose children, to teachers who have to teach it, the parents whose children have to face this this progression of learning. Let's see if it's really a great thing for all of these people if the experts at the top benevolently did something that was good for the hoi polloi. That would be you and me, the little people. So supporters say Common Core is so great because of several things. These are phrases you hear constantly, so I put them in quote marks because I can almost not read a pro-Common Core op-ed without hearing these catchphrases. So it's also interesting to me that folks will say all of these things but never explain what they mean. So I'm going to give you a lot of explanation to help fill in some of those lacking descriptions. So the first thing is we hear about its quality. It's rigorous and it's internationally benchmarked. This is a way that they got a lot of business folks to sign on to it because business people, honestly, if you hire, I just talked to a friend of mine who works for a family business. They cannot hire a person who, will stay working for them for 2 weeks without just a temporary job, a person who can lift 50 pounds, work in their warehouse, and will stick at it and work moderately hard for 2 weeks or until the job is done. So I know that, business folks are looking for people who can answer phones politely, read basic English, do a little math in their heads, and so on and so forth. And so that's not happening in our education system, so employers are understandably annoyed at paying all these taxes and getting not even a basically educated, person that they can train as a result. So when they hear all of the experts telling them this is rigorous, this is internationally benchmarked, it will really push kids to excel, American workers to compete in the global economy, that sounds really good to anyone. And if you're a businessman, you don't probably know too much about education, you just know that you need to not have retards coming to you with a job application. Sorry, I shouldn't have used the childish word. You need people, who don't give you a catatonic stare when you ask them to do a simple thing like file papers alphabetically. So another thing that supporters about Common Core will tell you is that it's going to improve student achievement. Of course, that's the whole point of doing anything in education. If kids don't learn more, why go through all the trouble? They will also say, as we kind of touched on earlier, the process was, here's the phrase, state-led. It was not, it was not federal, which is true. It's not a federal thing. The states got together and did this. It was entirely, a model of democracy, of representative government, which is why we're all here today, trying to figure out what they all did to us. Then they talk about another concern is cost, because switching everything over in the entire education system is kind of expensive. Especially the technology costs we'll talk about. But they say, oh, those are just kind of normal transition costs. We go through new textbooks every 7 or 8 years, so on and so forth. So it won't be a big deal. And then when we talk about the data mining and the effective testing portion of Common Core, they will always say standards are not curriculum. That has nothing to do with Common Core. That's a separate initiative, and so on and so forth. So we'll just go through these one by one. So the first one has to do with the academic. There it is. Okay. The first one has to do with the academic quality of Common Core. And the first thing for you to understand, that any person who is implementing policy should understand, is that standards and testing, well, testing actually has a pretty good track record, but standards themselves have basically their track record is 0 on improving student achievement. So standards are goals for what kids should learn, right? We want children to be able to do X, Y, and Z in this grade in this subject. But the evidence that we have indicates that standards actually don't help children. Just setting out goals doesn't mean that anyone's going to get and reach those goals. Anyone can set any goal they want. I'm going to, all my kids will be able to construct a house by age 12. That's a really great goal, but good luck getting, a bunch of 5th, 6th graders to do anything like that. But let's go through some of the evidence. The first thing, some of these, the data on these 2 points just basically is that our international competitors, most of them, have nationalized education systems, just like many of them have nationalized healthcare. But there appears to be no relationship between national standards and student achievement. Countries with very high student achievement have national standards, but countries with very low student achievement have national standards. So analyses comparing these have basically said, internationally, we see no benefit to a country's students from them having national standards. The same is true of state education standards. So before Common Core came along, states had a variety of standards, and they were of various qualities. So the Brookings Institute, which is a left-leaning think tank in Washington, D.C., again, analyzed the relationship between really strong state standards and student achievement. And again, they found absolutely no relationship. A state could have really high standards and really low student achievement, or really low standards and really high student achievement. So you can read one of the quotes of their conclusions right there. So as I mentioned, the track record we have of setting standards, setting goals for students at a really high, removed from the children level seems to be that it's pretty ineffective. And we'll talk about some reasons why that's the case in just a little bit. As it mentions here, no one has ever field tested Common Core. This isn't like, Massachusetts standard. We took Massachusetts best in the country standards and said, look, we should have the best standards everywhere. Let's just take Massachusetts, maybe adopt them a little bit, not have everyone study Massachusetts history only. But we'll spread that to the nation because we know it's had a really good track record there. No, it's entirely a construct of several groups of committees who sat behind closed doors, 1/60th of which were classroom teachers. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. And so the folks, when you talk about this, if you ever get a Common Core supporter to respond to it, which I haven't yet, but I have read some of the arguments, the idea is that, well, just setting goals doesn't matter. We need an enforcement mechanism. We need to have tests to go along with it. So tests are supposed to be the way to dial down into the classroom to enforce that Common Core is actually happening in the day-to-day instruction of the teacher. Because the idea is that, well, you can set these goals, but how a teacher translates that, may vary across teachers, across states, across school districts, depending on, who's monitoring and how, and the various ways of monitoring. So we're just going to have one monitoring system. We're going to use tests to get into the classrooms with teachers in the day-by-day. So in the face of this, I'll just read this first statement here, then I'll substantiate it. A central goal, and this is stated by people who support Common Core, and I have several links here, is to create a crisis in education when many more students fail on the tougher Common Core tests. So there have been some pilot Common Core tests in Kentucky and New York, and about twice as many students fail those tests as previously failed their own state tests. So the idea is education reformers are frustrated with the fact that suburban parents believe their public schools are very good when, in truth, they compare poorly internationally, and that is true. So their idea is to herd all these intelligent, motivated parents, the swing voters who really make things happen when they get angry, and to try to get them angry by having more of their children fail in school so that they will demand corporate, centralist-style education reform. This is the dream. You can read those quotes. It's literally exactly what they say. So one of the four folks who was a lead writer of Common Core, who's named David Pullman, he's now the president of College Board, he said, expect outrage. They're looking to prompt a response of fear and anger from people in order to get them worried so that the people orchestrating this can come in and say, we have the solution for you. We have lots of reform that we're going to give your kids. We need you just to say that you want it and tell your lawmakers to do what we say. Okay, let's talk about the quality of Common Core as educationally. The Fordham Institute is a pro-Common Core think tank, and its Common Core research has been funded by the Gates Foundation. But I think, I still think that it is helpful to see some of the ways that they have compared Common Core to other states. So you can see, I generally do accept the conclusion that state standards compared to Common Core, or state standards, let's just take Common Core out of the equation. Non-Common Core state standards are of low quality. That's pretty indisputable according to who you ask. Now, whether Common Core is better, it depends on the analyst that you're asking and the perspective they're coming from. So this is a map of Fordham's comparison of English language arts standards of Common Core. And this is the map of their comparison of state math standards to Common Core. I should also note that in this study, they have done several studies of state standards before this one looking at Common Core. This one changed the rubric by which they graded all of the states in a manner that made Common Core end up looking better. So that included things such as, giving higher points to states that had fewer standards. So, but I mean, you can have fewer and hopefully they're better, and it is a good thing to kind of solidify what teachers should teach children. But objectively, just 9 is not better than 10, and so on and so forth. Okay, so there's some educational arguments for and against. And so I mentioned it's kind of complicated for a normal person like me and you who aren't content experts in math and English to say, I know that 4th graders must be taught X. But let me draw out some of the things about that are inside Common Core that have become controversial or that are easier to understand. So that you kind of can be informed about some of the things that are in there and the things that people are talking about with them. So we'll do the against first and the for second. So one of the lead writers of Common Core, Jason Zimba, testified to the Massachusetts State Board of Education when they were considering Common Core they asked him, what does it mean to be college and career ready? What is your definition of that? What does Common Core actually prepare children to do? And he said it prepares someone, a graduate from Common Core, for a non-selective 2-year community college. So that's not what most people think when they hear college and career ready. They think 4-year actual college. So it's important to kind of readjust that thought in your mind. Common Core also eliminates the requirements of algebra before 9th grade. If you have a child who is math inclined, it is essential that they get algebra in 8th grade or they will never reach calculus by the end of high school. And they basically then become remedial in college level math because calculus is a prerequisite to any math and science program in college. So when you take away that avenue or that path, that reduces, the ability of children to be good at math and science, especially if they're inclined in that direction. This is where it was already being really widely used to promote fuzzy math. I just had a woman from New Jersey email me. She's a grandmother. She has 3 grandkids that she watches regularly and she helps tutor them. One of them is a gifted middle school student who was accepted to a gifted summer program in math. But between being accepted, last fall and this spring when she's about to go, she has completely lost her hold on math. She's confused. She doesn't know what's happening. And the grandmother learned about Common Core. She said, now I know what's happening to my granddaughter because they put a new math program at her school because of Common Core. And she just, a talented math child, cannot understand what's going on. And so there are reports like this all across the country. There's a section of Common Core that deals with practices, mathematical practices. It's not the exact standards themselves, but it kind of tells teachers how to teach math, and it talks about exploring and developing concepts and so on and so forth. The long and short of it is that has been pushing school districts nationwide towards what you would know as fuzzy math. And the idea, being that small children are intellectually capable of discussing math, at a college level, and thinking it through rather than the traditional idea that you want to give children an automaticity with basic math skills when they're very young, so that when they get up to college level math, that's a foundation for them to begin thinking at the college level about math conceptually. Common Core also includes, so nobody knows why this is the case, an experimental form of geometry. It's non-Euclidean geometry, if anyone knows what Euclidean geometry is, which is almost never taught outside of graduate school. And the only place it's ever been tried was with smart Russian students, and as a program entirely collapsed. The new science standards that came out are heavily political. I'm talking to an Illinois group, but I'll just state it right out. They teach children anthropomorphized global warming. That means man-caused catastrophic global warming that requires government action to correct, starting in kindergarten. They also, Common Core includes an odd requirement of schools teaching certain percentages of fiction and nonfiction. They call it informational text. The English language arts standards say across the curriculum, children in elementary school need to have a 50-50 diet of fiction and nonfiction. And then by the time they reach 12th grade, they have to have a 70-30 diet weighted towards nonfiction text in favor of Common Core. Well, I'll talk about that a little bit right over here on the pro side. So what this does is requires English teachers who are not accustomed to teaching historical documents or nonfiction
to start doing that in their classes, which again is another obstacle for them to come over. And David Pullman, one of the fellows who I mentioned, wrote Common Core. He gave a model lesson to teachers on how to teach some of these historical documents in their English class. And in it he suggested, I'm an English major, I'm trying to think of the simplest way to explain this, a theory of teaching that requires cold reading. So you don't give students context or background information, you just approach the text straight on, which again is something that you learn about new criticism in your college level English classes, but it's a highly odd way of teaching English to young children, and it's one that most teachers do not use because it doesn't work very well with children. Let's look at some of the pro arguments. One of the best things about Common Core, especially in the English, is that it demands that students present evidence. The schools have become accustomed to having students write, what I did this summer, how I feel about this story that we read, and that's essentially useless. Children are, if you're 10 years old, you have very little experience with the world, and you need to be talking about something outside yourself rather than your own limited little brain and experiences, especially if you're trying to think in a rigorous academic context. So that's one of the things that Common Core does really well. Evidence, 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 give evidence for this support, so on and so forth. Common Core on the English side includes a suggested reading list that is very, very good. The only problem is that they're suggestions, and most states that have been adopting Common Core have sidestepped the excellent suggestions in the Common Core reading list, so that teachers still are left freely to pick whatever they want. And because Common Core in English is contentless, that basically means that there's no change from previous habits of assigning Justin Bieber autobiographies and so on and so forth. There's nothing in that is against Common Core. So the research on reading demonstrates that children need a broad background knowledge. So this is actually one of the things that has been shown to close the achievement gap. So the long and short of it is that children in households where the parents pay attention and talk to their children, those children get an advantage because they learn a lot more, a lot faster. They have picked up things from magazines, they've gone to many more places, they know what a zoo is, for example, and so on and so forth. And reading is kind of it's kind of like Velcro. The more
looks like we're watching again.
It's the speakers. It's the speakers, not the... Just leave the speakers.
So contrary to earlier theories about reading, where they said reading is a kind of contentless skill, you just need the ability to read anything, the research actually shows that you need knowledge to read about things. If you have never heard about a frog, it'll be extremely difficult for you to read any story about frogs or amphibians and so on and so forth, because you're struggling to figure out what's going on with these odd green creatures that don't seem to have feathers or fur. So just random reading assignments to gain basic skills, which is kind of the practice in many schools, is not helpful to children. So they need to know more things, and they need to know more core basic things about the world, important things that are shared information, part of the core disciplines of knowledge that we would all think of. So this has been translated awkwardly into the Common Core into the informational text requirement. The only problem is that the informational text requirement does not give any core of reading for children to learn. So as I mentioned, the children are still not going to be provided with a cohesive, sequential integration of knowledge into their minds. So Common Core's attempt to kind of respond to that research basically does nothing to benefit children based on that research. Again, an emphasis on source documents, on using evidence, that's very good in Common Core. And there's really big benefit for the 1.7% of children who do move across state lines in a given year to have an alignment throughout teachers' grades in most states in what classrooms will be teaching children. There's also some benefits to teachers if you think, they, for example, I have a sister-in-law who was a teacher in Arkansas, and she just moved to Indiana to teach, and the standards are the same now in both states, so it's, it's easier up curve for her to switch schools. So let's talk about the quality. Is Common Core high quality academically? According to several of the best state standards and international, it's mediocre compared to the best American state standards and international competitors, according to several content experts. So former U.S. Department of Education official and mathematician Zeb Werman said that Common Core math standards would graduate students below the admission requirement of most four-year state colleges, and the highest achieving nations begin algebra in grade 8. There's a fellow who also sat on the Common Core committee, the only mathematician to sit on the validation committee that acted kind of as the gate before Common Core was released to the world. He is Professor James Milgram, who is a Stanford professor, and he basically says his encapsulation of his detailed look at Common Core says that it sets U.S. children behind our international competitors 1 year in elementary school and 2 years by the end of high school. So to claim internationally benchmarked is simply not accurate. I actually looked at the portion of the Common Core standards that says, that compares Common Core to international standards, and it consists of about a third of a page in both cases, and it does not give a rundown of what state countries Common Core compares to, but it mentions that a handful of other nations do things like demand that students use evidence when they're talking about a text. I don't know about you, but that to me does not constitute an international comparison of standards. So on the English side, University of Arkansas professor and reading expert Sandra Stotsky, who also served on the Common Core Validation Committee, with 4 other members refused to sign it. One of her reasons was that the writers of it refused to provide research that supported what the core requires children to do. So the people who were on the committees were asking the 5 people who controlled Common Core. So I've talked to several people on the committees, and they said, I don't know what my input did. The only people who would know were the 5 lead writers of Common Core. It says 4 in here occasionally because one of them was added, and he's not always identified as a lead writer. So it's 4 or 5 people who essentially wrote Common Core, the people who had the final say over it. Now, by the way, none of them have ever been K-12 teachers, and half of them never had written education standards before. But those folks who were controlling what went into Common Core refused to provide other people on the committee that were supposed to say, yes, we approve, this is really what we've been selling states on all along. They would not give any evidence that this was the case. So Dr. Stotsky said, I can't sign off on this. And so her other reasons include the English ones, which it's got hard to follow, low quality English standards of empty skill sets. So for example, this won't be word for word, but it will be an example. A 5th grade English standard goes something like, analyze and compare a text looking for information about the main character. And she says you can apply this to any single text in the whole universe, and you can also have this standard applied to 1st graders and high schoolers. It is not a grade-specific, content-specific standard, and therefore, in her mind, doesn't even qualify as a standard. It's an empty skill set. I've talked to several of the nation's top public schools, and I picked public schools because, well, they have to abide by all the same rules other public schools do, and they have to admit any students who come to them, and so on and so forth. And they have basically been telling me, we don't pay any attention to Common Core because it's not as good as what we've already been doing with our students, and our students finish all of Common Core by 8th grade. And let's see here. And as I mentioned earlier, the proponents who talk about Common Core ignore that the federal government pushed states to lower their standards, so kind of set up Common Core to look like it was a lot better than state standards by degrading state standards in the first place. Let's go on and talk about federal involvement with Common Core, and we've talked about a bunch of it before, so I'm going to skip through some of this. The only thing I want to highlight here is, besides the organization, the federal government and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funding the NGA and CCSSO, the big businesses that benefit from having a nationwide market for Common Core materials and tests. That includes Pearson, the biggest education publisher in the country. So they basically paid to play. They paid money to get something that is massively benefiting their bottom line and helping consolidate the education market into one player. I've gone through this. I didn't mention before that the federal government is the only funder of the 2 national Common Core tests that are coming out in 2014-2015. And the federal government has set up a secret review panel. By secret, I mean we know that they exist because they we found out from the bios of one of the people who was on it that this existed, but they will not let anyone attend the meetings. They're behind closed doors, and I have requested access. None of that will be granted. I have, and several other people, you know, public meetings, federally funded, so on and so forth. No access. But they have a review panel that is reviewing down to the very items on the test what will be on these Common Core tests, which happens to be illegal. 3 federal laws prohibit the federal government from influencing, directing, controlling standards and testing, because that happens to not be in the Constitution, besides the fact that, well, all the U.S. education laws that are major ones prohibit that kind of involvement. And the federal government just paid these groups to do what the federal government cannot directly do itself. Let's see here. So the Gates Foundation has spent $35 million to educate lawmakers about Common Core, flying them to swanky places, having speakers talk to them and wow them with how wonderful it is over bottles of nice champagne. They spent another $10 million to educate parent-teacher organizations, associations. Okay, the last one I want to highlight here is that states cannot change Common Core. If they adopt it, they must adopt every single word of it. And as far as we know, and we have asked, several times the folks involved, and most people say, we don't know, we've never had that question before. There is no way to alter Common Core in the future, so if a state happens to find out, wow, this particular one just isn't fitting, our children or our teachers don't understand what on earth is going on, there's no process by which they can, mention that and have Common Core, have kind of maybe a hearing process, an amendment process to update and improve Common Core. None of that exists, but states can add up to 15% of additional information to the Common Core standards that is their own, but that part will not be on there will be no enforcement for that because it will not appear on the federal Common Core tests. And private nonprofits hold a copyright to Common Core, and they also have a disclaimer on Common Core. We are not liable for any bad things that happen as a result of people using Common Core. What those bad things might be, I can't imagine. Maybe children not learning to read very well. I'm looking for my water. Okay, so here are some of the political arguments for and against. They include, well, a massive expense for untested, politically suspect change. The Pioneer Institute, a Massachusetts-based think tank, one of the lead organizations working on Common Core, has estimated that Common Core will cost, just to implement, so the phase-in process nationwide will cost about $16 billion. So by state, that will be, for a state about the size of Illinois, it should be around $300 to $400 million. As I mentioned earlier, this is how Common Core affects private homeschools. You would think you want to opt out, just go, homeschool your children, put them in private school, or if they already are, they're safe, right? We can do what we feel is best for children without constraints by everyone else who is doing, another progression of learning that we just, do not agree with. False. 2 ways Common Core affects private and homeschools are through testing and curriculum. In 26 states, homeschoolers have to take the state test or some sort of test to prove, that they're not sitting on the couch all day just watching television in their pajamas. And every single test that I have been able to find, and besides the state tests that are now traded for Common Core federal tests, so the Iowa Basic, the Stanford 10, the Terra Nova, the SAT and ACT college and entrance exams, every single test, the GED, are all now aligned or being aligned to Common Core. So if you want to say, look, we want a different opinion about where my child is, or we want to, use a more respective test rather than, or respected test that, we have a long history with, and many private schools use the Iowa Basic, the Stanford 10s as kind of a basic diagnostic on how their kids are doing. But basically, you want to go to college, you want to get a diagnostic on your kids, you only get the Common Core diagnostic, you only get the Common Core seal of approval. There are no other alternatives. So the decisions about schools are now out of the hands of the people and their elected representatives. As you see, almost all of Common Core happen this way. As I mentioned, federal involvement in curriculum is flatly illegal and unconstitutional. I know that doesn't matter to a lot of people, but it matters to me because it's important to have a rule of law, which means that people know ahead of time how the rules of the game are set up. so that they can function within those rules, and that's how you create an orderly society. And if you have administrative fiat changing the rules according to their whims, then basically society collapses, and you have more and more power at the top removed from the people. And I happen to hope and still believe that we live in a republic, and I hope it continues to stay that way until someone notifies me well beforehand so I can go somewhere else. And then when you create basically, it's hard, you can't call Common Core a federal system, for all the reasons we explained earlier. So there's some federal encouraging, federal pushing, some federal involvement here and there, especially with the testing, but it wasn't created by the federal government. But what it is a centralized system. It's, one centralized system controlled and written by a bunch of people who you didn't elect, but who are doing things that you have to pay for, and that are going to influence your children, how your children learn, and how your neighbors learn, and your future citizens and workers and so on and so forth will learn. So when you create a power center like that, it basically creates an irresistible, this is political theory, it's not theory, this is what happens. When you centralize things and you take power away from the people who are most closely impacted and involved with them, you basically make it worse. You create a power center that special interests will go after, and because they're out there able to spend all of their time, all of their money, all of their effort on this one thing, as opposed to you and me who have, again, children, work, sometimes I'm just lucky to get myself dragged to bed in one piece at the end of the day. If it weren't my job, I wouldn't have time to, read through what these people are doing with my money. But the special interest, that's their whole job, and so that means that it creates a system in which special interests are far more likely, especially over the long term, to control what is happening in schools. And of course what that does, again, I don't know if you're familiar with the Nobel Prize winning economist Friedrich Hayek, but he talked about the information problem, which basically just says it's common sense experience and good economics, that the people who are closer to the problem know what it needs. For example, if my brother is lazy and sitting on the couch in my mom's basement for 2 years not having a job, I know, that he doesn't have a mental disorder, he doesn't have a physical disability. He needs, mom and dad to kick him out of the house, tell him to get a job. Someone far away would see, oh look, here is, somebody who needs a handout, or so on and so forth. So because I'm closest to my brother, I can say either, wow, he's depressed, he needs to see a counselor or something, or no, he's just lazy, time to get him a job, tell him that, no food, no work, no eat. So the same thing is true in education. You have a teacher facing a child, a mom facing her child, and she said, she knows whether her child is tired, lazy, being obstinate, or so on and so forth, if they can't do the math, et cetera, et cetera. So when you take away and say, a bunch of people sitting at the center somewhere in ivory towers and closed committee rooms and know what is best for 43 million children. I was just thinking, population of the U.S., okay. It's entirely impossible for them to know what teachers and children in all the thousands of situations need and are best for them. Parents know that, teachers know that, and they can't get so the information problem is they can't get their information up the food chain to bureaucrats, because it's almost like trying to play telephone with 3.2 million teachers, 43 million children, and so if you assume 2 parents for every child, 80 million parents, or so on and so forth. It's just impossible. It doesn't happen. So it creates a bad system. Here's some political arguments for. Again, you can compare student performance across states. We already had that with the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's a test that has, I think it's about a decade old, maybe 12 years old, and it just gave, again, a well-respected, it's called the Nation's Report Card. It doesn't carry any carrots or sticks with it. It's just a diagnostic test that has, been really popular among parents and the media for as long as it's existed. Mobility is high, especially among the poor. So if you have children moving in and out of schools, it will benefit them, to be able to move into to have 4th grade follow logically from their third grade. Existing state standards are generally terrible, and as we mentioned earlier, some Common Core things that they do are better than existing widespread practices. I'm going to skip this chart, and I'll let you take a second to read this. A lot of folks, are saying, oh, governors on both sides of the aisle support this. We have Governor Mitch Daniels, Governor Bobby Jindal supporting Common Core, but there's a lot of disagreements on both sides of the aisle against it, and as Denise mentioned, there are a lot of really progressive folks in Chicago who are extremely against Common Core, especially for the loss of local control and the prescriptive testing required mandates. So Governor Bob McDonnell thinks Common Core is a waste of time and money. So let's get on to the costs, and those are mostly related to technology and testing. Because of Common Core, because the tests will be all online by 2017, 2018, so that's 4 years away here, I guess. Yeah, 4 years away here. Schools will need new or more textbooks, computers, teacher training, learning materials, IT support, and broadband internet. Oh, by the way, just 2 weeks ago, the first federal Common Core tax came out. President Obama announced the FCC can actually do this unilaterally without Congress. They're proposing increasing the tax on everybody's phone lines, cell phone, landline, in order to pay for a subsidy program that has been going on for several years called E-rate. And so this gives money to schools and libraries to get broadband internet. Before that it was phone lines and computers. And the justification for increasing this tax was that schools will be having new computerized assessments in a few years, and they need to have more broadband internet. So everyone's just going to help pay for that. Okay. So national cost estimates have varied from $3 billion to $16 billion nationwide. And the $3 billion one ignore the test tech requirements because they need not only hardware, computers, tech labs, earphones, and microphones for students to be taking these tests, but internet connections, newer operating systems, and tech support. I don't know if you all paid attention to the news this spring, but there are about 5 or 6 states that have massive computer shortages